Hello everyone! This time we're going to talk about race. It is a very controversial subject, and hopefully by the end of the lecture you will have a better understanding of the differences between race, ethnicity, and nationality, and the way that we as sociologists think of these concepts. So, the main theory that a lot of us use as sociologists in identifying the ways in which race plays out, but also things like gender and class as part of our own identities, comes from something called social identity theory, which was developed in 1979 by these folks. And when you think about 1979, try and think of the kinds of things that are going on. This is post major civil rights movement. This is post women's rights movement, the sort of second wave of American feminism that fought for the right for women to work in the workplace as well as civil rights for minorities. So post those times, people were trying to figure out a way to figure out how it is that we sort of place ourselves and how it is that we like to categorize ourselves. And that is social identity theory. And there are three specific things that occur at the individual level when it comes to trying to figure out who it is that you are in this world. And it's not just race, but all sorts of different things go into it. The first thing that happens is categorization. And categorization is basically where we put other people into boxes, and these boxes can be things like Christians, Muslims, Jews, black people, white people, hot, not hot, students, bus drivers, firebirds, perhaps, versus cougars, etc., etc. So basically, one of the things that we just do naturally as individuals, just as part of being social beings, is that we categorize other people and we try to figure out who other people are, and we place them in boxes. One sort of way that we can kind of think about this is happening probably in your space right now as students is think of the high school cafeteria, or think of the ways that people kind of separate themselves into groups in your school, perhaps. Maybe there's a group of people that are the nerds. Maybe there are a group of people that are the athletes and they stick together. Maybe the dancers stick together, or the theater people, or the musicians, etc., 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 right? So we put ourselves into, we try to put other people into these groups, and that is a huge form of identifying who it is that people are. We sort of, stick them into boxes. Then the second part is identification of ourselves into these groups. So first, we categorize people, put them into boxes, and then we put ourselves into the boxes. So where is it that we sit in that high school cafeteria? Maybe we're a nerd. Maybe we are an athlete. Maybe we're a dancer, right? Maybe we are part of the journalism crew or yearbook, right? So we try to associate ourselves with a specific group. And there is a concept called the in-group, which is basically a group to which you feel a very particular strong set of solidarity. And this could be based on race, perhaps. You might feel a strong solidarity with people of your own race, of your own ethnicity. Maybe you are Colombian and you feel a strong solidarity with people that also share that as your nationality, right? And then that would be your in-group. So, a Doral College student, right? That is an in-group that you are a part of. So we identify ourselves as belonging to these specific groups, right? And if you can think of how we talked about subcultures and maybe some of the subcultures that we can inhabit, those also count as in-groups. But specifically, we have in-groups that are based on kind of born-in characteristics like race, assigned sex, and sexuality, class, things like that. So, we stick people into boxes, we categorize them. We identify ourselves as belonging into one particular box, that's identification, and then we have social comparison, whereas basically we just compare our groups with other groups, and we compare themselves generally generally, in a positive manner. You don't basically go around calling every single person that's different than you an awful person, right? That just doesn't necessarily happen all the time. For the most part, you might say, oh, that's unique. I didn't know that you were a fan of Marvel comic books. I myself am a fan of DC comic books, right? But usually it sort of stops at, oh, this person is different than I am, right? That is a really, really strong part of developing your identity as an individual within society. It's a thing that happens. Now, historically, however, people have used that social comparison and have gone the extra mile to say, well, not only are these people different than us, these people are worse than us, or we are better than them, and we should do something about it. So, not all groups are created equal, and some groups are minority groups. And there's a really sort of fancy definition here for a minority group, but I'm going to pick out the most important parts. And the most important part of this definition is the idea that it can be, but it's not always a numerically inferior group than the rest of the population, and it is also a group that is in a non-dominant position. In fact, that is the most important part, I would say, of being a minority group, is that you are in a non-dominant position within a larger society. So, for example, we can think of racial minorities, right? So, people of color are considered minorities, and when I say people of color, that doesn't just single out black people necessarily, but it can also single out those that are of a darker hue than white, basically people that are not white, which can include a lot of people that might have the Hispanic ethnicity, perhaps, and it also includes those of Asian heritage as well. So, there actually might be a time, for example, I think the year might be 2025, where the Hispanic ethnicity is going to be numerically greater than the number of kind of white Anglo-Saxon folks in the US. And while people are sort of using that number as kind of an example of, oh my gosh, this might be the year that things change in terms of our culture or our politics, I would say that it would take way longer for that numerically superior number to have any actual impact on the way that our culture works. Why? Because of this non-dominant position. The population might increase, but as long as Hispanic folks are placed in non-dominant positions and we don't see a Hispanic president or Hispanic congresspeople or Hispanic lawmakers or Supreme Court judges or all of that, as long as we don't saturate the positions of power, things will probably still keep going the way they are. And that is why the non-dominant position part is key. Not only are these people sometimes numerically inferior in a minority group, but they also do not have positions of power within the wider society. And then, of course, one distinguishing feature of the minority group that makes them a different group is that they have some sort of difference from the dominant group, whether that is ethnic, religious, or linguistic language characteristic. So other categories or other characteristics of minority groups include that they suffer various disadvantages at the hands of another group, usually the dominant group. They are identified by group characteristics that are socially visible, so not necessarily the fact that you are a brony or a comic book lover, it does not necessarily make you a minority group. These are sort of more socially visible characteristics such as race and gender and sexuality. Then there is this idea that a minority group is an in-group where members feel a sense of solidarity. They usually do not become members of a minority group voluntarily. They're usually born into it, hence the sort of focus on minority groups being drawn along the lines of things like race and gender, sexuality, and class, as well as ethnicity and religion. And By choice or necessity, sometimes members of a minority group tend to marry within the group, although as we learned in our class lecture, marriages can also be exogamous in terms of and they could be exogamous for more strategic reasons, perhaps. You might want to marry outside of your minority group in order to perhaps gain more access or maybe marry up or secure more opportunities for potential children, for example. Now, what is race? What is race? Race is about dividing people into characteristics that are, dividing people into categories that are based on specific characteristics and beliefs about common ancestry. Now, the big thing about race is that it's all about visible traits, such as skin color, which is probably the most commonly associated feature of race, but it's also things like facial features and hair texture, as well as self-identification. So, visible traits, those are the things that go into race. That almost rhymed, and that might be actually a pretty easy way for you to remember it, actually. Now, race is a social construct, as a lot of things that I tend to describe. Race is a social construct, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, Professor Melendez, how can you talk to me about visible things, like objective differences that I can observe with my eyes, and talk about race being a social construct? Well, the physical differences are real. The fact that I might be darker or lighter than you, my hair might have a different skin texture, my nose might be shaped a little differently than you, there is no challenging that. You are correct. However, what we do with that information, the categories that we make up to describe it, what it means to be a white person, what it means to be a black person, what it means to be a brown person, right? All of those things, those are social constructs, and those change over time, and even in different regions of the world, you have different racial characteristics that might even vary from country to country. So the threshold from white to black might be different here in the US than it might be, say, in Cuba or Jamaica or Puerto Rico or in South America, for example. In Latin American countries, sometimes we have words like morena or trigueña, right, or mulatto, and those terms are used to sort of classify kind of different shades of people, and we do not necessarily have a lot of those equivalent words in the English language, which basically means this is a social construct, folks, right? The fact that we can have all sorts of different shades of people, and yet, depending on what country you sit, you might be called a different race, depending on what country you're in. That points to the social constructedness of race. Now we're going to take a sort of trip through time and think about the social constructedness of race by looking at the different ways that people thought about race throughout time. And I'll just sort of go over these relatively quickly. So one of the earlier theories on race came from the 3rd century Han Dynasty, where the inferior race were typically barbarians of blonde hair and green eyes who resemble the monkeys from which they are descended, and they were considered very much inferior. In ancient Egypt, when lighter Egyptians were in power, the darker group were evil, and when the darker people were in power, they called the lighter people the pale, degraded race of Arvad. And that basically goes to show that not only is the race consideration a social construct in terms of what boxes we put people in, but it also links to the idea that we have a tendency to very much match up our races with other characteristics, other moral and personality characteristics, that just because you're a black person you're supposed to act like XYZ, and just because you're a white person you're supposed to be XYZ, and usually the inferior race is listed as being either evil or pale or somehow morally or physically deficient. Now, this is actually one of my favorite racial theories, where it was this Native North American racial theory that involves God's oven, and he decided to bake bake a batch of cookies that were going to be humans, and in his first attempt at making a human, he burnt them, and and that is how black people were born. He tried the recipe again and didn't put them in as long, but then they were undercooked, and that is how white people are born, as God undercooked people. And then, in God's third attempt, he probably adjusted the oven temperature, I guess, and adjusted the cooking time based on humidity, maybe watched a little Food Network or something and got the recipe right, and the golden brown and delicious people that came out were the absolutely perfect American Indian race. So I kind of like this idea that that golden brown and delicious is actually the preferred color because we were baked right in a mystical oven somewhere. I kind of enjoy that one. Now, one of the key features that we see in a lot of racial theories, especially racial theories that come from the Western world, is this idea that we link racial characteristics, or, just like physical characteristics to things like constitution, temperament, mental abilities, and physical abilities. And races are not necessarily related to one another. They're totally separate people, and they form this chain, this sort of ladder of value. This is one form of stratification, if you will, right? So putting people on a sort of ladder with the highest of the highs on top and the lowest of the lows on the bottom. And this ladder was called the Great Chain of Being. And of course, as in usual kind of Western European things, Europeans are usually at the top of these great chains of being. So, when it comes to Western history of looking at race, we have the 1684 tome by Francois Bernier, thought to be the first sort of major Western characterization of race, where he found 4 distinct races, Far Easterners, Europeans, blacks, and Lapps. And, of course, in 1684, we're trying to, deal with this thing called the New World, and on this New World there are a bunch of sort of golden brown people living there, and he wasn't exactly sure where to place them, right? So a lot of these theories have a tendency to be quite flawed, because, we're not entirely sure what to do when we are encountering some sort of change in our system. So he has no idea where American Native folks fit into the picture. Later on, we have this German anthropologist, Christoph Menier, who came up pretty simple, a couple of races, where we have the Caucasian and Mongolians, with maybe dirty whites in the middle. Caucasians were, of course, racially pure, and they are exemplified by the venerated ancient Germans. Let's think about that for a second. We have a German anthropologist talking about Germans as the primary example of racial purity. If that doesn't point to the sort of social constructedness of science, then I don't know what does. I'm going to write a paper that says all red-headed Puerto Rican professors are scientifically the best people ever. Then we sort of move on to 1799, and we think of 1799, the things that were happening in the 1700s. This is the Enlightenment period. People are allegedly enlightened. We have these concepts of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, except for this guy, Charles White, who really enjoys this great chain of beings, where we have God up at the top, we have angels, we have demons, we have men, we have women, we have animals, plants and minerals, and then nothing. So, of course, women are closer to animals. And then when it comes to the sort of racial hierarchy, black people were halfway between whites and apes in the great chain of being. And that black people weren't necessarily people at all, but some sort of person-ape hybrid hybrid that mated with each other in Africa. Yeah, so enlightened, this guy is not. And then I just think it's kind of ironic that this guy is named White. He's a white guy named White, talking about black inferiority. That's wonderful. And then in the 19th century, didn't get much better, but we do have what is called the sort of scientific revolution that is happening. It's kind of like a post-Enlightenment thing. We really, really, really like science, and a lot of the stuff that was happening was a lot of major advances in categorization of animals and plants. We have Charles Darwin kicking around, doing his awesome theory of evolution stuff, right? We really, really like science in the 1800s, and people did not escape this scientific revolution. In fact, we further link biology to moral characteristics this time around. So there were 3 claims that are made about race. First, races are objective and they naturally occur. There are naturally occurring divisions of humanity. Okay, I guess you can sort of buy that. That at least the physical differences can be somewhat objective. Now, the categories, not so much. Secondly, there is a strong relationship between biological races and other human phenomena such as culture and material success of cultures. What does this mean? That means that white people are successful and were able to conquer a bunch of people because there is something in their whiteness that makes them more successful. Think about the way that would play out in the real world in the 21st century. Most CEOs are white because there is something in whiteness that makes them more capable of leading a Fortune 500 company. Black people are basketball players because there is something in their blackness that makes them awesome at basketball. There is something about quarterbacks that makes, I guess, white people more suited for the job, with very, very few exceptions, like Donovan McNabb and Russell Wilson, and Robert Griffin III. But then there's something in them that maybe makes them not as good, perhaps, as a Tom Brady or a Peyton Manning, and I can't quite put my finger on it. Right? So, this idea that there is something about your race that makes you more or less capable of having some sort of success is kind of funny, but when you sort of put it in a 21st century context, you realize that there might be some people that still think that way. And it's a very, very strong idea. Why? Because it's scientifically based. It's like, no, it's science. It is science. And race is a valid scientific category that can be used to explain and predict individual and group behavior. White people don't cause as much crime. Right? That's sort of, kind of the things that they're saying there. You are able to predict behavior just simply because of somebody's race. And this biologization of race, a sort of scientific link between race and other kind of cultural or sort of moral or physical factors, that is actually a really, really strong correlation that holds today for a lot of people. And things like moral character and intelligence, people are still sort of linking to racial characteristics. We could sort of, I hope that some of us are kind of like, well, that's silly because I know a friend who's XYZ and he's the opposite of what this person might predict. Yeah, I know, but it is still a really, really strong correlation that a lot of people still hold today. Case in point, Google. Now, Google itself is not racist. Let me preface by saying that. Google itself is not racist. However, sometimes people will search a lot on Google for things, and it will kind of try to autofill for you and make suggestions based on what a lot of other people have searched for over time, right? So, this is actually a screenshot of a Google search that I did just to try and see if there are any sort of very popular searches for all the different races, and Here's one, the idea that why do Asians do nails? Why do Asians use chopsticks? Why do Asians eat rice? And why do Asians have small eyes? So we are still trying to figure out A, categorizations, but B, why it is that we can still somehow link this idea of a biological race to other things like cultural stuff, like the food we eat and the utensils they use, but also the kinds of professions that are typical of some races. So, do the same thing with black people. Why do black people like fried chicken? Why do black people talk differently? Why do black people say axe, right? So even things like food choice and linguistics, people are very, very curious about. And if we take it to ethnicity, or rather nationality, then there's sort of this idea, why do Puerto Ricans look black, right? So people trying to figure out the relationship between race and nationality. Why do Puerto Ricans call themselves Boricuas? Why do they speak Spanish? Why do they have U.S. citizenship? All valid questions. And why do Puerto Ricans act black? So this idea that there is sort of this kind of acting black thing, and that people of a certain nationality are not necessarily usually the kinds of people that are linked to that act, whatever that act is. And of course, Cubans. Why do they drive all cars? Why do they look black? Again, a lot of people that can't figure out the linkage between nationality and potential racial variation, ignoring the fact that, of course, we had brown native peoples on both those islands, and history having to do with the African slave trade and bringing African slaves to the Caribbean, etc., etc. So there you go. People were not paying attention in their world history class, apparently. So let's take it to ethnicity. And ethnicity refers to selected cultural characteristics used to classify people into groups or categories, blah, blah, blah. It's all about culture. It is all about culture in this case. So, things about ethnicity. Ethnicity has to do with cultural characteristics and some sort of shared history of colonization, etc. So, this is why somebody can be white Hispanic. So, for example, let's take me for instance. I am a person of color. I would call myself actually of mixed race because I am definitely not white, but I would also not consider myself completely black. I would say that I am of mixed race because I have mixed ancestry of white, Spanish, conqueror's blood, as well as native Puerto Rican, Indian blood, as well as African blood. So I would call myself of mixed race, and I am a Hispanic person. I am a person of Hispanic descent because I am Puerto Rican, that is my nationality, and I am part of a group of people that has a very long history of a colonial relationship with Spain. That is what makes me Hispanic. And a lot of cultural factors based on that, the kinds of food we eat, the kind of religion that we typically adopt, right? So Hispanic people are usually typically of a Catholic religious belief, etc., etc. So all of the things that make up a culture, food, traditions, religions, rituals, the kinds of holidays that we celebrate. So like a celebration of Three Kings Day, and the marking of a quinceañera versus perhaps an anglicized Sweet 16 party, right? Those are the things that embody an ethnicity, which is why we can say that some people are white Hispanic, other people are black Hispanic, other people can be of like mixed race and Hispanic. And then this idea that, according to Max Weber, a big, huge sociologist, it's a pretty complex thing. But this definition down here is actually pretty useful, and it's become accepted by a lot of us. So the key factors in this definition is that there is perhaps a similarity of physical type, There's usually a similarity of customs, as I just mentioned, memories of colonization and migration, and it doesn't necessarily matter about kind of objective blood relationships with people so much as a cultural linkage between people. And that is kind of what we think about when we think of Hispanic ethnicity, for example. Nationality, on the other hand, is all about citizenship. In other words, the nation of which we are a member. So, for example, race. You're white, you're black, you might just consider yourself a person of color. Ethnicity, you are all about membership in a cultural group, so you might be, say, Hispanic. And then nationality, you might be a white Hispanic person, but you may consider yourself Colombian. And in certain places, your nationality matters more than others. For example, Miami, yes, we do have a lot of Hispanic folks. And for somebody to say, hi, I am of Hispanic ethnicity, okay, what else is new? Right? So, in order to sort of have this kind of sense of unique identity, we instead look for, yeah, but where are you from, though? Yes, you're Hispanic. Yes, you're American. No, but where are you from, though? Or, like, where are your parents from? Where are your grandparents from? And then that is where you would usually get the answer, well, I was born here, but my parents are Colombian. Or, I was born in Colombia, but now I am American. I'm an American citizen, right? So, ethnicity is all cultural. Nationality is all about citizenship, and it is the nation of which we are a member. If you are a person of color, perhaps of Hispanic descent, sometimes one of the most frustrating things you can do to someone outside of Miami is when they ask you where you're from, you say, I'm American. And that will mess people up. And you could sort of see the wheels turning in their head. They're going, how do I ask this question without sounding really, really racist? But it's true. You can clearly say, oh no, my nationality is American, but then you can kind of like, but where are you from? Where are your parents from? Where'd your grandparents come from, right? They're really trying to categorize you and try to put you in a specific box when they're doing that. Now, and as sort of mentioned before, you know, we like to sort of throw the word racist around in a way, especially nowadays. We have a lot of sort of controversy in terms of racism, etc. And here is what racism is. Racism is things that are done, things that are said, thoughts that are had that are based on racial characteristics, but there is also power involved, which is why there is no such thing as reverse racism, because racism has a really, really strong power contingent attached to it. If you are in a position of power, then that is sort of what might make you racist towards other people. Not to say that you being in a position of power makes you racist, but the idea that racism often comes from the person that is in a power position in terms of race. And there is no such thing as reverse racism necessarily, because there is no power distinction there. The words don't wound when you're punching up rather than punching down. There's no major history of subjugation, slavery, colonization, war, bloodshed going on there. If anything, it is a response to hundreds and hundreds of years of subjugation. That is not reverse racism. Doesn't exist. Now, instead of just calling things racist, though, sociologists like to divide these things and use a little bit more of a nuanced approach. So, there is a difference between thoughts and actions, and that is prejudice and discrimination. So rather than saying that something is racist, even though it can oftentimes be very, very easy to say, it's a lot more nuanced to think of somebody's prejudices, which are their thoughts. So as an example, there was a story of a young black man who went into a very, very expensive store in New York and wanted to buy a belt. Very, very expensive belt. It was like a $500 belt. And he bought it with his debit card. He worked really, really hard, saved up the money, and, hey, treated himself to a really, really, really nice belt. Now, not 5 minutes after leaving the store, he was stopped by police because the store clerk suspected that he was not the kind of person who could afford a $500 belt, and therefore had the cops detain him and try to figure out whether or not the funds were legitimately obtained or if he was trying to defraud them somehow. So, prejudice is thinking that a young black man can't afford a $500 belt. Discrimination is actually calling the cops on that kid because you think that he can't afford a $500 belt and he must be cheating you out of something, right? See the difference? Prejudice is all about the thoughts you have, but they turn into discrimination once those thoughts turn into action. So let's review. Race is a social construction based on skin color. Ethnicity is membership in a cultural group. Nationality is where you're actually from. Prejudice has to do with your thoughts, and discrimination has to do with your actions. So, now we turn to something called privilege and examining your privilege. In particular, white folks have been in a position of racial privilege for a decent amount of recorded human history, and a lot of times this position of power goes widely unexamined. And so what I ask you to do is look for, in the module, Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, and watch the video. It is a white, I guess, a theorist of women's studies who basically was trying to figure out why it is that that there was a lot of pushback from people of color in terms of the way that she was sort of treating them as employees, etc., etc. And she examined the privilege, and she examined a lot of the things that you have just by the nature of born with the privilege you have. So, the term unpacking the invisible knapsack has to do with this invisible book bag full of things that we can get automatically because maybe we're white, or automatically because we're a man, or maybe because we have some other, or maybe we're heterosexual, right? So we are in some position of privilege because maybe we are cisgender and our assigned sex matches our gender identity, right? So there are all sorts of different ways that we can have privilege. You right now, I can't see you right now, but right now, the fact that you're watching this video and taking this class, your education automatically puts you in a position of privilege above other people that might not necessarily have a shot at this kind of education, right? So watch the video and take down a lot of what Peggy McIntosh is saying there, and you can also view the article that the video comes from. And then in your discussion, I want you to write examples of ways in which you yourself are privileged. Mainly I'm looking for ways that you are privileged by race, but if you are not privileged by race, or perhaps you are a person of color, then try to think of other ways in which you are privileged, maybe along gender, sexuality, class, or educational lines, or maybe you are an able-bodied person, maybe you are an attractive person, all sorts of things. Now, one of the things that that white privilege does is it makes it so that the default hero of a lot of stories, especially when you're reading books and you're trying to picture things in your mind's eye, the default hero happens to be a white guy. And if you are not told who the hero of the story is, a lot of times we will fill in the blanks with a white guy. In video games, for example, the sort of typical protagonist is usually a white guy with a gun. Sometimes he has a beard, right? And white privilege means that you are used to seeing yourself in positions of power, in positions where you are the hero in a lot of fictional tales, whether that is superheroes in a comic book, action heroes in the movies, protagonists in video games, etc. And a lot of times, if not described, or even sometimes when they are described and we're sort of reading books, oftentimes, we are often used to sort of plugging in that default. And one example is during the movie premiere of the first Hunger Games movie, where people who had read the books watched the movie and were not entirely sure that they were supposed to be seeing people of color on their screen. In fact, because of the privilege of seeing all of their heroes as white, then it made it so that if a person of color appeared as one of the characters, it made it that it was such a shock to the system, they automatically disproved it, or rather disagreed with it. Did not approve. So, examples. There is a character in the Hunger Games book named Ruth, a little girl, and she's a black girl. In fact, in the book, she is actually described as being a dark-skinned girl, as being a black girl, right? But I guess people didn't necessarily read very closely, and they decided to sort of fill in the blanks with a white person. And so it's, why does Rue have to be black? Gonna lie, not gonna lie, kind of ruined the movie. Cinna and Rue weren't supposed to be black. Why did they make all the good characters black? Why is Rue a little black girl? Stick to the book. In fact, they did stick to the book, you just weren't paying attention and were being kind of racist. All sorts of other examples of this, right? Even though the book clearly describes these characters as black, and even if they didn't clearly describe these characters as black, seeing people, you know, that do not necessarily fit your racial kind of depictions of heroism in books, that is an example of sort of white privilege in action, right? So, all of these are just a sampling of different examples of ways in which if the movie doesn't match your head movies for racial reasons, people have a tendency to lash out, and people do that all the time. In comic books, the sort of new version of Spider-Man features Miles Santiago, who is actually a Hispanic person of color, and people are freaked out about that. In the Thor movies, there is one character played by Idris Elba, who is a black actor. People freaked out about that, right? So, a lot of times when people sort of place people of color that are decent actors in roles that either are explicitly stated as black, or even when they're not, there is a sort of backlash because they have the privilege of being able to insert themselves as the default in whatever stories they read. And then, of course, there's a spoiler alert there. There's a spoiler alert in case you haven't seen or read The Hunger Games. When I found out Rue was black, her death wasn't as sad. Right? So, the fact that not only are you kind of making arguments as to, you know, this person shouldn't be there, but automatically, because this person doesn't look like you, you don't feel the same kind of empathy for them as a person, and so their death isn't as sad. But if they were a white person, because they would be able to identify with them closely, because they are preferred, Then if they died, then it would be a little bit more sad. Let's take a moment to think about how messed up that is. Very messed up. So, this isn't something that is new, of course. In Hollywood, there is this thing called whitewashing, which is sort of the opposite of kind of what we see here. We see a black actress playing a role that is supposed to be played by a black actress, but in a role that people would commonly read as white, because she's a good guy and people commonly read good guys as white people. And in Hollywood, whitewashing is kind of the reverse of that, where we have Avatar: The Last Airbender started off as a cartoon where we had actually people of color being the protagonists and a lighter-skinned person as the enemy. Person that has not only light skin but light eyes. However, in the Hollywood live-action version, we have white actors playing the protagonists while the person of color plays the enemy, right? So the movie got absolutely ripped for it, but it is kind of symptomatic of a lot of what happens in Hollywood, where things are sort of whitewashed because perhaps they didn't, people think that people of color can't necessarily sell. Never mind the fact that we are in a state, in a sort of nation state with a huge diverse group of people that have a huge diverse amount of money. So try and think about ways in which race plays out in popular culture. Try to think about all of the conversations that perhaps we have been having as a society about race lately. Whether it's, Miley Cyrus twerking and whether, it's kind of inappropriate for her to twerk, or whether it is inappropriate for you to wear a Native American headdress to the Coachella Festival if you're a white person. The changing of the name for the football team, the Washington Redskins, right? So think about our discussions about race and ethnicity and nationality and how these play out on a popular culture scale. And see how it is that these are playing out in a lot of the stuff that you enjoy, because chances are they are, right? So join us next time when we talk exactly about media and technology.